Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to talk about large-scale VDC projects. We have the presence of Greg Dasher. Greg is currently a manager of digital delivery at Jacobs, where he manages and supports the use and delivery of digital information and processes throughout all phases of the project lifecycle. Greg has a diverse and accomplished career within the AEC industry and is experienced in multiple project delivery methods. And Dr. Will Iker, PE, PhD, is Director of Research and Education at Beamform Global. Dr. Iker will be moderating today. Welcome.
Thank you, Lisa. And Greg, thanks for making time for us today. I've had the pleasure of getting to cross paths with you a lot over the last decade and a half, I guess. And as we get started, we're going to be talking about large-scale VDC projects. And when we begin, I'm going to ask you how do we define that? Because it's a relative term. Before we begin, though, I would like you to share just some of your background and how you got into the role you are today. What did you start studying, and where has your career taken you, and how did technology weave in that? One of the things we talk about, and I ask those who are interested in this industry, and they're very interested, what's the on-ramp? How do I get into this industry of the building industry and technology in specific and how it relates to it? And I always tell them, your degree is just, your first step, because you're going to have 5 careers and 3 of them don't exist yet because technology is going to move that rapidly. So with that, kind of tell us where you began.
So I saw that question and it made me kind of laugh, because I thought, well, I'm going to show my age a little bit and it's going to sound like I'm ancient, and I'm really not.
You're not.
You're only as old as you feel, right? So
Amen.
It's funny because my story is actually really cool to some people. I actually learned AutoCAD in high school. There was a drafting class. I took it, learned AutoCAD. It was early days. I think it was 2.4, 2.5. I don't remember. It was in that mid 80 time frame, right? So it was cool, right? I mean, this is new age computer stuff, and no one knew anything. Teacher didn't know how to use it. Nobody knew how to use it. So I learned it, thought it was awesome. And while I was in college, which I was on the engineering track, right, said I'm going to engineering school. And so while I was in school, there was an engineering firm really close to the campus. And I walked in one day and said, hey, I know how to use AutoCAD. And they were like, really? And they were like, well, we need to talk. And so they actually hired me. They had 2 computers and they had about 50 people, most of them still drafting on the board. So yeah, right. It sounds like that was 80 years ago. It really wasn't.
No.
And so I was able to step in there and kind of work part-time for them, come and go as I needed to go to campus. Decided engineering was not my thing. I decided I did not want to do this for the rest of my life. And so then I changed that focus on the technology side. I love the technology, right? I was like, all these new computers are coming out, and this stuff is new to everyone. How do you build a computer? I mean, I was into all of that at the time. And so I kind of shifted focus and went the technology route. Stayed with them for 8 years, moved to Erie, moved to a bigger firm, right? Went up and decided I needed to move to Atlanta, went to Erie, worked for them for a while, ended up in an integrated design build firm in Atlanta. And then
So the first firm was design, and then
design, doing I did some civil stuff. They were primarily structural, about 50 people, and then of course I just moved right into Erie, which was again bigger design.
Okay.
Of course, they did some program management and all that too, but primarily I moved up there to support this continual technology track with Erie, and worked with them for 5 years. Left there, went to an integrated design build firm. So that was kind of my first touch into the construction side of the business.
I see.
And that was where my real main change from the 2D world to the 3D world took place. That was in that 2005, 2004, 2005 timeframe, right? So that was,
sure.
I think Revit was like version 3 or something like that on the structural side. It seems like version 2, version 3. So it's fairly new.
Mm-hmm.
I'll talk about Chuck Eastman in a minute, because there were a lot of cool things coming out of Georgia Tech at the time, and I got tied in with him through the business owner at the time who had graduated from Georgia Tech. So that was cool to get to kind of meet with and get to know Chuck Eastman, because he was, some people call him the father of BIM. So that was kind of the next step in my career.
Yeah, I guess, for context, you're correct. Revit structure came out around that 05 time frame.
And so then left that company, moved to Balfour Beatty Construction in Dallas. And so that was, stepped out of the design side, went just straight up construction at that point.
Okay.
Stayed with them for a while, moved to another Suffolk Construction. And then here about a year and a half ago, stepped back over to Jacobs. So I've kind of design, construction, back into design. Of course, Jacobs does a little bit of everything, but so again, it's more integrated firm, I guess you could say, but heavy focus on design, again, certainly where I'm at now.
In that, when did you see reality capture really starting to become, when you first saw it, and then when it became much more, commonplace?
It's funny. 2006 probably was one of the very first laser scan reality capture jobs we did. And that was it was very interesting because the firm at the time was pretty advanced that did the scan for us. And he and I sat down because we wanted to actually integrate our Revit model at the time into his scan data. And he had never done that before. And we actually produced a video of that. And that was probably 2006. So that was the start of my effort with the primarily laser scanning, but reality capture, yes.
Definitely. And then just for context, when you're going into the engineering school at the universities, were they teaching AutoCAD at the time? Or,
unfortunately, they were all lagging behind. Everything that you saw, even on the technology side, right? They're still teaching these old. The PC change was coming, and they were still teaching this old mainframe programming and all that. So the universities had not caught up at the time. I know that they have now, but at the time it was moving too fast for them to be able to adapt, which was very interesting.
I think we might we might touch on this a little later, but some of the other the speakers over this year that we visited with, one of the critiques is the traditional university education system. In some instances, even today, is not fully keeping up with the rate of the change.
I would say that's true with some that don't have that focus, right? If you're going into some of the universities, if you're going into a construction management program, then of the larger ones that are known for that, then they usually tend to kind of keep up more than some that are offering it more as a fringe program. So.
Right. Well, as we segue into this, I want to, the theme of today is large scale VDC projects, and that can be a subjective term. And you might give us just a little perspective. I think everyone probably knows, but how many people work at Jacobs, and how long does a job last for a typical Jacobs project?
Jacobs is a large firm. Certainly the largest I've been a part of. 60,000, I think, roughly is the number that's thrown out there. I could probably get an exact count, but that's close enough.
Yep.
I actually work in the life sciences division at Jacobs, so it feels a little smaller because that group's a lot more, a little easier to deal with than Jacobs as a whole. Large projects, even at Jacobs, are going to change. I mean, I'll be careful about clients that I speak of, but there are a couple of large projects that Jacobs is a part of right now, and these are massive. Two of the largest in the world currently. So
definitely in the billions.
Yes, and so those are going to present their own challenges. In my world, when I say large, I guess, and it's kind of commonplace for some of ours, right? These are projects that have multiple work streams on a site, or multiple divisions on a site, if you will. And they'll tend to have 10 to 12 different work streams, and they'll have 10 to 12 different models. So we start talking about just the design models alone are, you know, in that 120 model range. You're dealing with those normally. I mean, that's normal for us. Not all of our projects are that big, certainly, but that's not out of the norm. And I actually was on a call with Autodesk for some model open times, right? Because that becomes an issue. And I know there's probably a question about that later, but we had a model that was taking an hour to open, and one of the users had you know, they were complaining, of course. And so Autodesk had asked us if we had any models that were taking a long time to open. So I actually did some analysis with them, and that one single model had 20 models linked into it, and it was a total size of 37 gigabytes worth of data that were linking into that one model.
Oh my!
It was taking an hour to open, and luckily was able to find the reason and got that to open in like 12 minutes, right? So still a long time, but again, that gives you an idea of kind of the scale of what you're dealing with from a size wise.
Impressive. I think you obviously would remember, I think some of the first projects, you know, I was engineer of record on Ceiling. We're in, I think, Revit Structure version 2. But a lot of our team was still in Windows XP 32-bit, and we had less than 4 gigs of RAM to work with. And even then, you had to really focus on how you segregated models. And it almost seems, you know, now that we're all these years later, computer power keeps increasing, but so does model size. And we still have to think about model segregation and really planning out how you structure the data, just as you would any database planning in that perspective. I guess just for context, you've probably, you know, you've obviously also worked on quote unquote smaller jobs over the years. If you had to, you know, give us your kind of list on the biggest differences between going from quote unquote small projects up to these larger ones. You know, model size is obviously one of them, but what are other dynamics you've experienced in working on these large projects?
Technology is always going to be an issue that you need to address, right? Because if I'm working on a model that's, you know, got 6 disciplines involved and they're all fairly small, that's pretty easy. If I have a problem with one of them, if it propagates through, it's still not that big of a deal. I can address that really quickly. Computing horsepower, that kind of thing. That's always going to be a challenge with bigger ones. And I think generally IT, the typical IT doesn't plan for that, right? They're trying to hit the sweet spot from a cost perspective to not buy a lot of computers that are monster computers. And then you get a monster job and you have to address that. Now I'm backtracking, trying to say, okay, we've got to either buy new laptops, desktops, add more RAM, add more hard drive space, whatever it may be. So I think that technology piece is always going to be there, and it's always going to be a challenge. The thing that seems to impact us the most is that propagation of problems. So if now I've got a project and it's got 120 or 150 models on it and all these work streams, and all of a sudden I realize there's an oops here. We run into a problem that we've identified. And that problem has propagated across those models. My one problem just became 150 problems or 120 problems. You cannot address those instantly. Now I've got a team that's all screaming, going, what's going on? Why did this happen? And you have to have a team of people that can jump in there and fix that quickly. So I think, to me, that seems to be the biggest issue, right? When you're in there working, the tools are all the same. Yeah, things are a little slower. Things are require a little bit more time. But once you're in there working, all the processes are the same. It's when things break or when they can't be figured out and you're starting to troubleshoot those is when you really have the problem, because now I'm having to go through multiple models to try to figure out what's happening.
I think we'll touch a little on this, but I want to maybe talk about how do you see communication vary from small jobs to large? You kind of alluded to it already. I mean, small jobs have 5 people.
That's, you know, and I know you lead into another question there. This this dynamic that we're in. And again, at Jacobs, for me, coming out of the construction world, I tended to focus on projects that were local, right? You're working on a project that you can go sit with a project team and you can see them, or you can go to the construction trailer, or you can go to the main office and everybody's in the same location. That has been changing over time. COVID certainly had a major impact in how people are working. Just had a corporate call today, and that was mentioned, right? You pushed everyone out of the offices. You pushed them at the house. I stand here at the house right now today. And so now everybody's remote. That communication piece, I think we're still adapting to that. We're still trying to learn how to do it. And I know every company's in that boat, right? If I've sent everybody home, do I call everybody back? Well, look what's happened with some of these large firms in the news where they've called everyone back and said, if you don't come back, you're looking for a new job. Is that the right approach? I don't know. There's some balance in the middle there somewhere. And I understand why they're doing that. They're worried about the culture. They're worried about the dynamic between the people that are working on these project teams. How are you able to develop that team and that culture and that closeness when everybody's doing what we're doing? We're talking on the phone or we're on a video. And so as Jacobs moved into that COVID realm and pushed everybody out, our projects got a little bit more dynamic because of that, because now we had the ability to be a truly global company and have a global team where you've got guys on the East Coast, you've got guys on the West Coast, you've got folks in Europe, you've got folks in Asia, and they're all working on the same project. And so now that project just went from a 8 to 5 project to a 24-hour project. And I see it, I see it because I come in, I log on the computer, my little dot goes green, and I immediately get a phone call. It can be 4 a.m. I talked to a guy yesterday, and it was 5 a.m. in the morning, and he had already been on the phone call with someone over in Asia because they were having a problem on something that he was working on. So that dynamic is certainly something I don't think anyone's figured out yet. But I think we've done a good job of it. You get on these Teams calls, right? And I just had one with a guy today. Didn't know him at all. My profile picture actually in my Teams is me holding a bonefish. And so people's got their nice ones, right, with their suit and their tie on. Everybody's different. And I thought, I don't want to do that. I want people to know who I am when they see my picture in Teams that they don't know me. So I have a bonefish picture. I can't tell you how many people that I don't know at Jacobs who've seen that and had a call with me and said, hey, tell me about the fish. And that's what we did this morning. I talked with him about the fish and the Bahamas and catching fish, and that's my passion. That's something I like. And so he and I now have a little bit of a commonality. I never met that guy until today, never talked to him until today. And so I still think you can build that relationship through the computer by doing things like that. You want to get to know that person a little bit, and an icebreaker like that really helps, in my opinion. And then you step into the issue that was at hand, what he needed help with. So,
in some of the studies we were doing with BIMForm Global, we're talking to teams on how they handle the sociology of this, because many of us heard before, these kind of changes with new processes in VDC are probably 10% technology and 90% sociology. And some teams I've heard, they during COVID, they found outdoor events where they could bring their project managers together. Some companies did golf, and this obviously only works if you're local. Some did sporting clays, some did fishing, but they tried to do something either weekly or monthly, and they'd be talking about projects, but they would also just be sharing successes, challenges, frustrations. And I think teams need to be heard. My own company is, distributed over different countries, and that's a challenge. How do we get everyone together? Some teams will do a weekly huddle where everyone's encouraged to get their cameras on. They're not talking about a project in particular, but just how do we communicate better? So those are all good takeaways in that. Just to also, I guess, to bookend this kind of discussion of quote unquote small versus large, what's the typical life cycle of one of the projects you have? In some ways, it's accelerated because you now have a 24-hour design clock. But are these 6 months jobs, 2-year jobs? What's the life cycle of some of the designs you're on?
I'm trying to recall. I'm almost sure that was on one of our Jacobs calls, and one of the leaders mentioned time to delivery on our kind of a typical project. And I'm almost certain that was in our company. This was recent, and I'll mess up the numbers, but it was basically saying, hey, what used to be very common for a 4-year project is now a 2.5-year project.
Oh,
Or
really?
they expected it in 2.5 years. So it was, we heard that 10 years ago. Same thing. It was the same message, right? That you were hearing these projects were getting more and more compressed. And again, on the construction side, we saw it. I saw it at Balfour Beatty, and we talked about how these projects keep getting more and more and more compressed, and it's still happening. And there's only one solution to that, and technology. Technology is one of you have to have technology in order to help you do things faster, better, quicker. It's not the only solution, certainly. Being dynamic and being able to change and work 24 hours a day can certainly help. But on our monster projects, yeah, I think you're looking, it depends on whether you're just doing design or design construction, of course. But on some of these bigger ones, you're turning these things around into 2.5 years on design. Certainly smaller ones are, your more typicals taking 14, 16 months. But then a lot of our projects too they start and they seem to never end because they lead to another one, especially on these larger sites. And so you really never stop working for a particular client for a long time, right? You may build something on one site, and then before that one's done, you're started the next one and the next one and the next one. So those projects can go on for years. Some of them probably been going on for 10 years.
We're in 3 years on an airport right now, and it's
and
been
no end in sight either, probably.
And it's a great experience, and we're loving each facet of it. But you are correct. It starts in one area and keeps growing. And I think another thing you're talking about 2 to 2.5 years schedule, and I don't have real current data on this, but over the last few years, the average turnover of recent graduates is typically, I think, around 3 years at a firm. And I don't, in some what anecdotally I've been reading how COVID may have accelerated that. And I don't know what you're seeing in other, you are a global company. So I don't know how this varies across countries, but are you seeing that turnover be a challenge? Because if you're on smaller projects, you could, ideally, if someone's wanting to move on to another company or change career directions, they'll let you know, and in 2 weeks you could gather information, do a good handoff, and both part ways in a positive way. But the size projects you have, 2 weeks may not be enough to really do a handoff. How does that challenge change on small to large projects?
So I'm making a note here because you said two things. First, I do want to mention time on these large projects. Relate it back to kind of technology, this VDC thing, the tech we're talking about. It's another challenge when you're going to step into a project that may last 2, 3, 4, 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
The things you put in place today, you may not have even considered what's going to happen down that road on that large project, but you may know that it's going to continue, and you're going to have to address them. You're going to have to address model upgrades. You're going to have to address some of those things along that journey from a technological standpoint, and then the things that you don't know. So a lot of thought needs to go into that upfront setup as much as possible. And when I say thought, We have a large one that's kind of starting now, and the team has really sat down and said, what do we do today to prepare us for tomorrow? And that was a group effort, right? If you reach out and you get input from multiple people, chances are somebody's going to bring up something that someone else hadn't thought. And so that teamwork, to me, that collaborative teamwork is very important in that role, to get everybody's opinion. And that way, when it does go south, you can say, hey, we all missed it, right? We had no idea this was ever going to be an issue, and we did our due diligence up front, and now we deal with it. But at least you have the whole team together saying, well, this is why we made that decision. This is why we made that decision. I think that's important. That leads into the second question you asked about this turnover. As a large company, we have, let's just take the turnover from people leaving Jacobs off the table. We have a lot of turnover internally, right? Someone will be on a project, and the next thing you know, that person's off on another project because it's so dynamic who these people are and where they're going. And we see that a lot, right? So you're working on a project and you're building that relationship with someone. They have the knowledge of it. The next thing you know, they need to be pulled off to go tackle another one that come in the door, and they replace that person. So you have both what I'll call internal and external turnover. And those are, it's always going to be challenging, especially when you're segmented off in these silos like we are, and we're not talking, or if we're not talking. And that person tends to walk away with that knowledge because it hasn't been shared. Now you've left a hole that someone has to fill. And usually by filling that, there's a lot of things you have to figure out. So it kind of leads back to that collaborative sharing of information, talking as much as you can to understand who's doing what, and hopefully not have someone leave a project either voluntarily, involuntarily, that leaves you in a bind, basically. And that's, again, that goes back to that collaboration, doing exactly what we're doing right now, although it would be more on a project team meeting. So.
One area I've seen that firms have reported to us that is helpful is just recommitting to standards and clearer role definitions, and envision that everyone's carrying a baton in a relay race, and knowing how to do that handoff so that whatever they're carrying is well defined and their notes are in a common area. And another thing that has helped, some firms have reported, is just in some ways we have a lot more meetings today, I think, than I can remember when I started my career, because I think it's easier to, pop on Teams and get a group together. But there is a value in doing meeting minutes and just documenting, okay, this is what we're doing. This is who is carrying these things. So that's something I think that's evolved a little and become a little more dynamic.
And that was one of the notes I made when you asked me this question. I was just jotting a few ideas down, and that was one of the ones I had jotted down about how we collaborate. If you go back in our history, we did not have the tools that we have today. Again, we're primarily an Autodesk shop at Jacobs, a lot of Revit, a lot of Civil 3D, that kind of things, and with like the construction cloud. You didn't have that ability back when we started all this. You could not really do that. Yeah, you could share some models here and there, but now you have tools like that, and it's not just the Autodesk tool. There's lots of other third-party tools and apps out there that allow you to put cloud-based data out there to where you can share it. Again, that has allowed us to be global as well, right? I can put that out there, and someone in Texas or someone in Asia or someone in Europe can work on the very same thing that I'm working on at the same time or at different times, and we all know where that's at, the status of it, single source of truth, very important. I'm not going to say that Jacobs has got a perfect handle on that. Certainly we don't, because there's so many tools out there. If you segment that data off into, some data's over here in Teams, or some data's over here in ACC, and some data's on the server, therein you start having an issue, right? Because now it's been segmented, and someone goes to this location thinking it's going to be there and he can't find it. So that is a very important piece, especially as you're dealing with larger projects that are big distributed teams. Having a single source of truth for data common data environment, as we call it, is a very important aspect.
Yeah, I guess as we think about this, because we're going to talk about the future towards the end of this, but and it may be in some of the topics you've already alluded to, but what do you see as the greatest VDC challenges you've encountered, let's say over the last decade, and how'd you overcome them? Because later I'm going to ask you, what do you see as the biggest challenges moving forward? But
probably, I'm always going to go back. Technology is technology. Training is training. If someone knows how to use a product or doesn't know how to use a product, you can usually get them fairly up to speed. There's plenty of tools out there to teach you how to use Revit or MicroStation or whatever you're using, right? You can get to that tool and teach them that technological piece. It's the collaboration on the VDC side of things. You talk about what VDC is supposed to be and the collaboration that's supposed to be included with that. It's changed the dynamic of how people need to behave and what they need to share amongst themselves. And maybe I step ahead here. I'm not sure kind of future. This isn't really future, but you think about quantity takeoff from a model. Mm-hmm. So at one point in time, the designer didn't really care about quantity takeoff in a model. He just did his design because he's producing a 2D sheet that he needed to stamp and sign and give someone. If you start wanting to have these downstream uses of this information, whether it's model data or anything, you can take this outside the model VDC environment even. If there's a downstream use of what we're producing, now that person who's producing the upstream data needs to understand that. And that is an educational piece. It's not a technical training piece. It's an educational piece of this big picture and how it all fits together. So if you're not approaching your projects with the end goal in mind, and it being clearly defined for everyone, you're going to miss something. You're going to miss something, or you're going to start off on the wrong foot, and then somewhere down the road, someone's going to say, "Hey, we want to do so and so," and you're going to say, "Well, we didn't plan for that," and now that's a problem. And that has been there since these early days of what we were doing.
Sure.
Understanding what's in the contract. What does the contract say I'm supposed to deliver at the end? Because sometimes even that's missed, and you get so far down that project, and you're like, "Oh, we have to deliver so and so." It's like, well, we didn't really set it up that way. So, getting that team to understand how their parts impact others, either upstream or downstream, I think probably is the biggest challenge in what we're doing from a VDC standpoint. The technical pieces and parts of it, yeah, we can address those fairly easily. It's that understanding of the big picture that's probably the biggest challenge, and will continue to be.
I think that's a good point to it, because the understanding the big picture, the picture is expanding. I remember, as you said, I started my career off design side, did my graduate work in 3D parametric modeling of structure, and that was in the mid 90s. But when I really started practicing design side, you are correct. Schedule and quantities were really in the domain of the ways and means of the general contractor. And there, under good designers, architects, and engineers, there was an awareness of it, but it was also understood that is someone else's domain. And we would put notes in drawings that would say contractors should allow a certain percentage extra to be used at engineer's discretion for rebar or quantities. And it's because the tools we had at the time, we were dealing with design intent with 2D construction documents to create permit drawings. And one of the challenges many firms would articulate over the last 10 years was, it's great our young engineers and architects are in 3D modeling platforms, but they want to model too much. And I was always, in the back of my mind, was thinking, is that the problem with them? Or is that the problem with you and your firm in figuring out how to market your services? Because I believe if shed in the right light and owners can be presented with the value proposition, there's a case to be made for more detailed modeling earlier on the process as part of the design. I know they'll still, on smaller jobs, there'll still be schematic design development, but just an awareness that we're wanting to build a model that is of value. And I think that's been a big change I've seen over the last decade. And your feedback kind of reminded me of that aspect of it.
You think they're purpose-built models, right? What's the purpose-built? What's the purpose of it? And go read any model release contract from a design company and read what it says. It says, do not use this for anything other than its intended purpose, which is to produce my 2D plans. So we're still not there. You go read any model release contract right now, and I'm sure it's going to say something very similar to that, because again, this is not a new discussion. It's an old discussion that's still here. I do think, and I know I may step ahead a little bit. You talk about where is it going? Owners are now getting a lot more in tune with what's available. And it's taken them a while. I mean, seriously, 10 years ago, there were a lot of owners who didn't want to talk about this stuff. There's been enough change in the industry over time that now owners are getting very intelligent on what's available to them from this and wanting to leverage that more and more. So then it opens up those discussions where you can say, okay, if you want XYZ, we can give you that, but there are some impacts. There's always going to be impacts. Maybe they grow too big. Maybe I'm building one purpose-built model for this and one for something else. The answers are not there certainly, but at least that discussion's going on. You look at the tools that are available to us outside of these foundational tools. You go back 10 years again or more, you had the foundational products. We had the modeling tools. That was awesome. What we didn't have were all of these tools that were available for us to really do some of this stuff well. The early QTO from Autodesk, I mean, yeah, it did some stuff. Now you have products from third-party vendors out there that can really hook into these models and pull data out and do stuff with it. The dashboarding, the just pulling data out and presenting it in a manner that you can look at it and understand it. The quantity takeoff, and I hate to mention products, but there's some nice ones out there that can hook into that model data and pull that stuff out. And I think that's where it's headed right now. We have the tools for the downstream uses that we didn't have not that many years ago, which then are going to drive people wanting more and more of that.
Right. So this one, BIMform Global, is software agnostic. So we do a lot of interviews with team members, and they use different proprietary platforms, and they're, some are, using, brand A, and some are, using brand T, and some are using brand B. But how have you seen IFCs grow in demand from the ownership side? Do you see it come up more now? That has been one thing that has been, some have identified as a challenge over the last maybe decade, was interoperability on IFCs. And there's a lot of finger pointing. Is it this, is it brand A's software or brand B's software? But where do you see IFCs today, and do you see that growing?
I don't think we have enough time for me to talk about this subject.
So, that'll be part two.
Boy, you hit on something. It wasn't even in my notes, but again, I'm going to go back to these 2005, 2006, 2007 timeframes. There were things we were trying to do at that time, and it was still young. And the interoperability word kept coming up. I can't open this with this. Navisworks is now my only solution, and that's the only way I can aggregate it. We'll add all these tools that we have available today. That problem has just magnified. And I know even at Jacobs, it is a big deal because we get stuff from lots of people, especially on these some of our specialized projects where we're getting stuff directly from vendors who have, they're doing their own modeling, and again, some of their higher end tools in your inventors and SolidWorks and those kind of products, and you're trying to share that data. And we want it real time. I want to be able to have access to their data today, and when they update theirs tomorrow, I want that back in my model. It's got to that point, and that is a huge challenge. And IFC is a player in that role, and I can't tell you how many hours, man hours, that I personally have seen at Jacobs be spent with this interoperability issue.
Yeah.
And there's never the silver bullet, so to speak. There's never that perfect way. There's, hey, I can do it this way, but, and then there's something, or I can do it this way, but, and then there's something, or I can do it this way. So there's lots of ways to get where we want to get to, but there's always something that's not perfect. You know, I can pull in the IFC, but now he tells me he can't get this data on it when he clicks on the object that's not pulling the right data, and so now it's no good for him. So,
sure,
IFC, I wished it was the silver bullet. I wished it did everything that everyone needed. Unfortunately, it's not always there. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's the perfect format. So yeah, we tend to step through lots of different products sometimes to get data from point A to point B without losing the information that we need. And that will continue to be a huge challenge. But at least IFC is a good start. I mean, it is the right start and a good start. I just think in some instances it doesn't do what it needs to.
Yeah, I look back, the whole interoperability challenge is not new either, you know, in the sense that when you began, you know, we probably had 5 1/4 discs, and 3.5 were coming in. I think AutoCAD version 13 was the first Windows version. Before that was 12, and you get a big stack of floppy disks. And I had been working on historic buildings, and so some of these drawings I would work on were 1920s drawings on linen that were white lined blueprints on linen. Yeah. And these are over 100 years old, and I can still read the information. Some of them still have pencil marks from when they were being built. And then I look at some buildings I worked on 20 years ago, and when I visit with the owners, they don't have any of that data recorded, and it was all in CAD. Yeah. All they have are some rolls of drawings that were, you know, in the basement, water on them, and then the true as-built information are pencil marks in that field set. And so, ironically, we've had this phase where sometimes the best data medium to transfer all this was, you know, linen and paper. That information, you know, is still usable on some projects where the digital wasn't. And so now that we've gone to cloud computing, there's a lot of promise for that. But how much time on your large projects are you spending on archiving the data, or is it really now just built into your workflow with using the cloud deployment?
It's built into the workflow for the most part now, thankfully. Mm-hmm. We're not perfect, you know. Most folks aren't. They always have their issues. Again, it goes back to that deliverable. What am I supposed to deliver at the end of it? Mm-hmm. Is it just a PDF file? If so, that's a pretty easy deliverable. Our thought process is now with our common data environment, we're really trying to make sure that everything is in ACC. And it doesn't have to be ACC. Any cloud environment allows you the ability to keep that data in its structure, whatever that structure may be, and to hand that off downstream. And I've done some. It wasn't with ACC specifically, it was with a different one where we actually stood up a site for that owner. And you could have done it with any of these. You stand up the cloud site that the owner didn't even own at the time, and we worked in that one. We set up our environment so that we were working in his versus ours. At the end of that effort, all we had to do is have that owner disconnect us from his site, and now he has all the data that we were working in. There's
Right.
you a handover. Now you've got the data structured in the way that we needed it structured.
Exactly.
Everything still works. If it's a model, that model still works. If there's an export going to Navisworks, it still works. The owner just disconnects us from his site when we were done, and now he has it and he can take off with it. And if he wants to give another design firm or a construction firm access to that data, then he can do that. If he's paid for that and that's the deliverable that we're giving to him, then great. That was kind of eye-opening. We're not there yet. Certainly at Jacobs,
Right.
we're not doing that to that level. But if you go with that mindset to set things up the right way up front, you can do those at the back end.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And so that gets into, these model handovers. Are most of the ownership clients on these larger projects using the data beyond project turnover? Are they starting to use it in their facility management? Is it vary a lot? Or do you see trends where it's growing, that they're proactively using the models after construction?
I kind of alluded to that earlier. It's changing. It
Mhm.
is growing. You have owners who are becoming more intelligent in what's available to them. And so before, when you were typically working with an owner or client, you had a contact, but that contact, he could spell BIM, probably couldn't do much more with that. Now we have owners and clients where we actually have a BIM contact. You actually have a BIM person on their side that you are now beginning to communicate with. And I know you've seen this in some of your work too, right? So there are owners that are beginning to build these groups internally so that they can at least take the data and do something with it. Whether or not that's contracted on the design up front or not is, that's different. But at least they're beginning to put some time and effort in building these internal groups on their side to take the data and then be able to manage it and work with it. I have one right now that's relatively new start, and there is a guy that he's actually a fairly new hire for the client, and he will tell you he's not a BIM guru, but he knows what it does. He knows what it can do. He understands how it all works, and he knows what to ask for. And so it's nice to see, right? Because then you're saying, oh, well, we can probably fix that and make that work for you. So yeah, I think that's coming. That's probably one of the things that we'll begin to see. And again, that's going to start with your larger clients, right? Your big ones, and they'll begin to ask for that more and more, and then that'll eventually grow down to some of your mid-size and smaller ones. And of course, there's some of those already that's asking for that, but I think you're seeing that trend across the industry.
This next question I'm going to ask you, this was something you'd brought up. This was a couple of years back. You'd mentioned this to me, and I've seen it a lot of places since. And I'd like to talk about this curve we're about to talk about, that you originally introduced me to, in the terms of technology adoption and that balance of you talked about education being a big part of it, and it adds a little stress to the team to keep them billable. You talked about compressed schedules, and when do you have time to train and learn new versus stick with what you've been doing? But there's three main key points of this curve, but maybe introduce this to us. Like I said, you had mentioned this to me a few years back, and I found it very helpful in understanding stress and performance.
So I'm not going to profess to be a huge reader, and I do like to read. I just tend to not have a lot of time to read too much. but I do like to come across pieces and parts, and I pick up a book here or there if it's somebody says, "Hey, you just have to read this," and so I will do that. But going way back, there was, I think it was Zig Ziglar, I believe, there was a book I read, and there was a concept he had in there called peak performers. He talked about people who would rise up to any occasion and perform really high, but they couldn't stay there. They had to taper back off, and they had to decompress, if you will. And then there were other performers who were more the turtle, right? Not saying they're slow, but they were just that steady. I'm never really going to go too high or too low. I'm just going to keep that steady pace. And so he kind of explained all these different ways people perform. So that was a long time ago. At Balfour, there was a guy come in, Bob Kelleher, and he's employee engagement. And so I will do a plug for him. If any of you haven't heard of him, you might at least want to go check him out. He does some great presentations about what motivates people. How do you keep employees engaged? How do you, it's not about giving them a bigger paycheck. I mean, yeah, all that helps and nobody's going to turn it down. But he's like, you can throw money at somebody who's unhappy and they might be happy for a little while, but they're just going to turn up the ground and be unhappy again. And so he touches on a lot of that. Well, then this kind of comes into that same concept of how do people perform, and understanding that, I think, for any company is very important. And when I saw this, I thought, boy, this is great, because there are things in my job that arousal or that interest is on the low scale. I'm just not really, I don't want to do that. And so absolutely, it is very hard to motivate yourself. Some of it you just have to do. It's those things in your job where you have to do it. You just have no desire whatsoever to get engaged there, but I still have to do it. So on your project team, when you're working for these global teams, I think it does take a little bit of that. It's up to management and project managers and their managers to kind of paint that big picture and to try to strive for that desire, that arousal, that interest in people, to get them to at least operate somewhere on the upper side of that curve versus the lower side. When that stress gets, they use the term arousal. You can apply stress to that because that's really what it's talking about. When you apply stress and that stress gets too high, then you get to that point where people freeze, they lock up, they then become disinterested. I don't even know where to go today because I've got 50 things that are all due, and I'm done. I get mental block. I can't focus. When you get to that point, you're not helping yourself on the stress side of things. You're certainly not helping the company because your performance is gone. It's just not there. We see that, you see it across everything that everybody does, but we certainly see it on these projects that we deal with, the compressed schedules, the disconnected piece, the being lost. I just thought this was it's simple, but it is a good talking point. A lot of companies, they do focus on personality profiles and that kind of thing to try to help their teams understand the members and who they're interacting with. This is just as important. When you have those, whether it's a team member that's on a team that's a direct report or not, it helps to understand where that stress level is for them or that desire is for them. Because if it's too low or too high, then that requires some management at that point to try to say, can we do something, or can we bring them more in line to get that peak performance out of them? And I know that's important for me. It's important for me to understand that too. Some of the tasks that I have that I just don't want to do, you block out a time and say, hey, I'm gonna tackle this and knock it out so that I can move on to the things that I do want to do, and I get back in that curve where I'm actually performing where I want to be.
Yeah. One of the things, I've shared this with a number of other firms and asked about it when we're doing some of the background research that BIMForm Global conducts. And one of the things that was brought out to it is for the team member, they are obviously the best suited to give feedback of exactly where they are on this scale of stress. And they may think, they may have concepts of how they measure their performance that the project manager is held accountable for. But the project manager is most in tune with actually being the best arbiter of where the performance really is, because the project manager has to answer to that. And one thing I've found helpful is some teams have given feedback is this is a great conversation piece, because the team member can say, this is where I really am on the stress scale, and this is where I think I am on my performance. And the project manager could say, based on the exterior factors of this project, this is where we are on the performance. I thought you were somewhere else on the stress scale. Yep. But it's it's one of these areas where it really takes the manager and the team member working together to communicate, because each one is making assumptions on where the other is. And the project manager, has to be able to give their perspective. And just as the way we were designed, we have two eyes, because that's what gives us depth of field in our vision. If we only have one eye, we lose our depth of field. In the same way, in this relationship between a team member and a project manager, what I love about this chart is it puts it on the table and allows them to have a conversation. So they get two separate perspectives and they get depth of vision, and then they can really see to hit the target. Because once you lose that depth of field, you don't hit the target, you're off. And you're missing the objectives.
Yeah, I would certainly encourage, like I say, that employee engagement. If you're a people manager, that is well worth your time and effort to look into, because it talks about that engagement for employees and how to keep them off the low and keep them in a role where they actually are in the middle section there.
No, excellent. We do only have about 3 minutes left. Greg, thank you so much for doing this. Like I said, we could probably go, I want to invite you back later to dive deeper into interoperability. That's a whole nother hour plus. Yes. We could probably spend on that alone. For those interested, the 22 LOD specification is out. It's available at BIMForm Global /LOD. And these weekly webinars are continuing on through October. And we have coming up next week, we're going to be visiting on photogrammetry and drones and that aspect of reality capture. We will then follow up with VDC coordination from a general contractor's perspective. And that'll be later this month on the 19th. And then Robert Pleasance with Satterfield and Ponticus will be talking about really bringing together the VDC part from the modeling side and the reality capture together from project case studies. If there are any questions, please feel free to send those in. If we did not get to them all today, we will follow up. And this recording will go on our YouTube channel. Louisa will be sending out more information on that. If you know of topics that would be of interest, you think, to the community, please let us know and send those to Louisa, and she'll be looking to engage those speakers as that moves forward. Again, if you are wanting to find out more about our educational events, it's BIMForum Global /events, and the specifications are on bimforum.global/LOD. And Greg, again, thank you so much for your time. I know you are very busy. You have projects going on with teams around the world, so you're getting calls all days of the week. But thank you again for your time, Greg.
Yep. Thanks, Will.
Very good. Thank you, everyone.